The Daubert ruling suggests that the safest way to judge between good, bad, and junk science is to go back to basics and look at the case through the lens of the scientific method. The scientific method has become so well accepted that it has now become part of what is taken as today's common sense. Historians know, however, that today's common sense was yesterday's heresy, and usually resulted in burning at the stake. Galileo broke with tradition by the mere act of using his telescope to actually look at the heavenly bodies. He found them to be imperfect, with earthly characteristics, which did not accord with accepted doctrine that they were supernatural phenomena with perfect characteristics. The scientific method, as it has come down to modern times, is the subject of much discussion. Some of the more important elements are shown: empiricism, replicability, theory, falsifiability, corroboration, social context. If even a single component of this set is missing or distorted, an analysis can give the illusion of science but be deeply flawed. For example, a psychologist may collect reliable, valid evidence of memory and concentration problems in a patient, but lack a theory of how this came to be. The patient's history may be vague. There were no witnesses. The patient thinks he was unconscious and can't remember being electrocuted. The literature does not link mild electrocution to these particular brain symptoms. Without a theory, the data will not be sufficient in itself for a full application of science, and no amount of further or detailed testing will be able to falsify the hypothetical diagnosis of brain damage. Falsifiability refers to the open frame of mind that will allow new data to make the scientists change their mind. In the pre-scientific era, it was impossible to prove or disprove the existence of angels, for example. To give preference to physical evidence over the opinions of religious authorities was heresy. Galileo's fictitious character Simplicio sounds remarkably like a judge from the 1923 Fry era 300 years later.
I confess that all last night I was meditating on yesterday's material, and truly I find it to contain many beautiful considerations which are novel and forceful. Still, I am much more impressed by the authority of so many great authors.
The Galilean tradition thus evolved as a set of conventions based not just on authority, but on what by now seems a common sense idea of collecting some data to test a theory, revising that theory when observations do not accord with observations, retesting, and documenting the process so that other scientists might apply and replicate the procedure. As simple as this sounds, there is within it huge scope for error and fraud, and there are still places in the world where such loose Western thinking could lead to your execution. The popular association of Galileo with the invention of the telescope, and the spectacular success ever since with the development of technology, has given a prominence to the role of the gadget over the idea in science. Hence, we have the distinction between hard science, exemplified by the technology of chemistry, physics, and biology, and the soft sciences, using the technology of communication, such as tests, questionnaires, and interviews to collect data. The quality of the science is limited by both the intellectual component, its theories, interpretations, and methods, and the technology, its instruments. What is not commonly understood is that hard science may be called in to solve an inappropriate problem, whereas a soft science may work perfectly well with that same problem. For example, prior to the invention of CAT scans and MRIs, neuropsychological testing, a soft science application, was in some cases more sensitive to brain dysfunctions than the technological solutions of the day, such as angiograms, pneumoencephalograms, and skull x-rays. These devices were at that stage only hard technology, but not hard science. They were not sufficiently sensitive to detect brain damage. Whereas the soft technology of asking the patient to perform intellectual tasks was sometimes sufficient to demonstrate the damage. A simple analogy can be made to computer science. If I drop my laptop or iPad, a hard science technique, such as X-ray, may not be able to detect any damage to the components. nor might there be any chemical forensic technique that can detect broken circuit links or disk damage. However, a soft science technique, such as entering some commands, might quickly reveal that something isn't working. It might even be able to roughly distinguish between disk and other component damage. As another example, the lie detector polygraph collects hard physiological data such as heart rate, respiration, and skin conductance. There is seldom doubt that the technological data is hard in that these are reliably measurable and cover fundamental physiological processes. What is in doubt is the scientific value of the technology in relation to the question they're trying to answer, i.e., whether these measurements correlate with psychological phenomena such as lying. The introduction of polygraphy into forensic psychology is a classic example of the limitations of technology in contributing to science to solve what is essentially a legal and social question. It also shows that hard technology should not be confused with hard science. Although scientific method has become common sense, a perusal of the news shows how often such a simple process as this is violated. Being eminent is not proof of being honest. As the Daubert rule implies, an eminent person could give only selected parts of the process, giving the illusion of hard science to a deeply flawed set of observations. Worse, the club-like cohesion of scientific groups makes it very difficult for even fellow members to expose flaws in the methods of other members, even when they detect fraud and supposedly have the weight of the law behind them in reporting it. There are many temptations to go well past the boundaries of junk science and into the realms of fraud. In New South Wales, we have had the spectacle of 2 royal commissions which severely criticized the lack of safeguards against fraudulent science in the courtroom. New South Wales Police Royal Commissioner Wood stated that his faith in the judicial system had been
somewhat shattered
after reviewing a psychologist's report on a criminal suspect and being told
it was easy to manipulate the criminal trials with biased expert reports.
New South Wales Mental Health Services Royal Commissioner Slattery concluded that a psychologist had
severely compromised his professional independence and brought discredit on himself and on his profession. He cautioned that the publishing of codes of conduct, test standards, and guidelines for the use of tests has proved inefficient in ensuring acceptable standards of practice. The previous system, despite its many merits, did not prevent, in Australia or elsewhere, the use of assessment and treatment techniques of dubious value.
The McBride v. Walton case in New South Wales, in which a doctor was struck off for falsifying data, largely hinged on the issue of honesty in medical science and the necessity of enforcement. The British case of Quidway v. Brown in the Court of Appeal was cited in the judgment as setting a standard of misconduct as that which
would reasonably incur the strong reprobation of professional brethren of good repute and competence.
This is similar to the circularity of the Fry criteria, as it relies on brethren rather than any abstract or objective standards. A key problem with such approaches is the rarity of actual enforcement against such practices. The situation is analogous to the question popularly associated with Bishop Berkeley in the 1700s on the nature of sound.
If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound?
A legal equivalent would be,
if an expert witness knowingly says something false in a court, and there is no one who will prosecute perjury, is there a crime?
The framers of legislation in modern countries are all too well aware of the deficiencies of trying to rely on the integrity of officials to keep the system honest. Former Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam told a press club luncheon that the integrity of the Australian Westminster system relied on the Chief Justice of the High Court and the Governor-General to be honourable men, and that he had been advised that he had been naive to make this assumption. In comic timing to the journalist's guffaws, he quipped, "Well may we laugh." Psychologists' registration boards in Australia are a good example of this reliance on persons to be honourable. An examination of annual reports often showed that those few complaints that actually reached a hearing were commonly for sexual misconduct, not clinical misconduct. Patients and peers can recognize inappropriate sexual behavior, but would find it much more difficult to know when clinical behavior, such as writing a biased expert report, was deliberate misconduct. New South Wales law actually shelters expert witnesses from the complaint system unless someone actually charges the expert with perjury. So regulation is still very much an honor system. Well may we laugh. Lord Hewitt in 1928 addressed this very same straw man argument about experts being allowed self-regulation.
Why should the work of the expert be always at the mercy of the ignorant amateur? Why should people be allowed to try to govern themselves when it was manifestly so much better for them to be governed by those who knew how to govern? Undoubtedly it could, replied the Chancellor of the Exchequer, undoubtedly it could. And I am quite sure that you and your colleagues would govern the country remarkably well. But let me tell you this, my young friend, at the end of 6 months of it, there would not be enough lampposts in Whitehall to go round.
The point Lord Hewitt was making was that the rule of law should not actually require hanging of experts from lampposts or floodgates of litigation to be opened to have a desired effect of keeping the system honest.
What is really of value, and of inestimable value, is the public and permanent spectacle which shows that if contracts are broken damages must be paid, if torts are committed unpleasant consequences follow, and if crimes are perpetrated punishment must be suffered. With the total result that in general contracts are not broken, torts are not committed, and crimes are not perpetrated. It is really a vast system of public insurance. The knowledge that the machinery exists, and that when it is employed with skill and without favor, has the effect of rendering its employment unnecessary save only in the exceptional case.